Okay, guys, let's take a quick look at this. Yep. Somebody have an extra assignment? Handout on niacin? There should be an extra one. Let's look at that handout I just gave you on niacin real quick. Now, so it starts off history of niacin nutrition. The nutritional history of niacin is unusually colorful and involves Italy, Mexico, and the American South. The documentation of niacin deficiency seems to have started a long time ago when corn was brought to Spain by Columbus. Corn is distinguished as being low in niacin. The introduction of corn to Europe resulted in its widespread cultivation. It replaced rye as a major crop. Corn became popular in Spain, southern France, Italy, Romania, southern Russia, and Egypt. Pellagra, a disease resulting from severe niacin deficiency, followed the cultivation of corn. This disease is characterized by severe dermatitis, so it has these 4D, basically the 4 Ds of symptoms. Dermatitis, fissured scabs, diarrhea, mental depression. The disease associated with those conditions, because of the third D, mental hospitals proved to be a convenient place to find and study the disease. Now, so if you look at one more paragraph, pellagra was noted in the 1760s in Spain and Italy. A special hospital was employed for pellagrans in Lugano, Italy in 1784. Later in 1917, a special hospital was set up in Spartanburg, South Carolina for those suffering from the disease. In America, during the Depression of the 1930s, about 250,000 cases of pellagra occurred, and 1 case in every 35 was fatal. Okay, so here's kind of what happened. This is a really good example how years ago, when anyone got sick from the food that they consumed, they assumed it was a microorganism. This is one of the classic examples of a change in diet that was utilized by a significant population. And if that diet was deficient in something, it became, in this case, niacin deficiency became an epidemic. So thousands and thousands of people had it in the American South. And the reason it was kind of focused there was because that was one of their staples, was corn. And it was especially prevalent there because of the economic status of those individuals. They didn't have a lot of other sources of food, including protein sources, and they relied on corn. Corn is low in niacin. We'll talk about why in a few minutes. The other thing that corn is low in is tryptophan. We can actually synthesize some niacin in our body from tryptophan. So if you think about it, that's a really unlucky combination. You're relying on a food that not only has low niacin, it's also low in tryptophan, an amino acid that we can use to make niacin. Well, we've all heard this, how plants have different amino acids than animal sources, and sometimes that means that the plant source of protein is a low-quality protein compared to the animal source. Is tryptophan an essential amino acid? It is, okay? So it's an essential amino acid that happens to be low in corn, and that complicates not only protein synthesis, but also the ability to synthesize niacin. Okay? So what do you think in the U.S. now? Is niacin deficiency common?
No.
Why not?
Enrichment program.
Enrichment program protects us. This is one of the main reasons the enrichment program was set up, because of this niacin deficiency. And what else? Could be fortification, but in general in the U.S., we've come a long way economically, and for the most part, we're fortunate that most people in this country have access to better sources of food than they used to, especially during the Depression. So now those other protein sources that we consume have tryptophan, and we can typically generate niacin from that tryptophan. So there's a few things that have really changed for us. So read through this. And one of the interesting things is If you think about it, when, for example, people from Europe came to Mexico, Central America, South America, a lot of those populations in the Americas were relying on corn. They were using corn tortillas and different types of preparations from corn. Their preparation methods were different. They included an alkali step where they actually used kind of an alkali water that had calcium hydroxide. That made the niacin more available in that corn. So when the Europeans started cultivating corn, they left out that step. And that was the main problem. So they had no idea what the problem was, and they realized it was a simple kind of food processing step that had caused all that niacin deficiency in Europe, and then also in the U.S. and the South. Okay, ready? Niacin. Okay, so when we say niacin, we are talking about, that's a term that covers both nicotinic acid and nicotinamide, and those structures are shown here. So nicotinic acid, right? Nitrogen-containing ring structure, and it has a carboxylic acid group, so it's an acid. Nicotinamide, same cyclic structure, except it has an amide or an amine group. So it is called nicotinamide. What do you think about their size? Pretty small molecules, especially compared to some of the other ones that we've talked about so far. And one thing to keep in mind with these is because of their size, their transport across cell membranes is a little bit different. We'll talk about that. Now, what do you think? If you look at these molecules, pretty simple. I think they can be interconverted. They can. And so we'll talk about that as well. So, for example, we can consume nicotinic acid, convert it to nicotinamide, the other vitamin form, and then we can eventually metabolize that into the coenzyme forms. So these are the vitamin forms. They can be modified to coenzymes. So the major function of these vitamins is to make the coenzymes. And we've talked about these a lot. So here, this is probably the first time we've looked at their structure though. Here's the structure of NAD and NADP, the coenzyme forms of niacin. So down here is kind of the key. It says right here for this R group, it's just a hydrogen if it's NAD. And this whole molecule, NAD, remember, is nicotinamide, adenine, dinucleotide. So you want to maybe practice spelling that out. If I show you this structure, you should be able to write that out. Right, so it has an adenosine group, 2 nucleotides. Here's our 2 phosphates. That's what we're saying are nucleotides. It has a ribose, and then there's nicotinamide at the top. The only difference between NAD and NADP is NADP has a phosphate right here. That's it. Has a phosphate group right here. Do enzymes recognize that? Yeah. So if an enzyme uses NAD, it doesn't use NADP. It uses either or. Uh-huh.
On NAD, is it just an H?
It is. Mm-hmm. So the next one, I'm going to go through this pretty quick. This was kind of I'd say an old experiment, but a classic experiment where they showed, and this was done in mice, and we're just going to go kind of from left to the right. There's nicotinic acid, a molecule on the far left, and I'm going to go through this quickly. We're going to say in a multiple step process, nicotinic acid can be converted to NAD. So we can consume nicotinic acid. It can be converted to NAD, which is over here, in a multiple step process, mostly in the liver. Okay. I think that's enough for there. What are some sources? This one's pretty easy. Sources of niacin. This slide probably either looks really good to you or really bad, especially right now in the morning. Sources of niacin. In general, protein-rich foods such as meat, fish, poultry, and peanut butter contribute much of the niacin in people's diets. Enriched breads and cereals and a few vegetables are also rich in niacin. And of course, some foods are fortified with niacin. So it tends to be fairly widespread. So we're going to remember these sources. So for niacin, this is pretty simple. Protein-rich foods and enriched grains tend to be major sources.
So when you're saying enriched grain, it would be the level of niacin would still be adequate in a grain that was whole, that was like never had it.
Yeah.
A little bit removed.
Yeah.
Okay.
Exactly. In supplements, niacin is generally what form? You ever looked at a supplement bottle? How many of you guys know someone's taking vitamins and mineral supplements? Okay. You ever looked at the label? Sometimes hard to figure out what each one of those is, even though it's a vitamin mineral supplement. You look at it and you go, yeah, I have no idea what that is. If you see nicotinamide on there, that's niacin. So in supplements, it's usually nicotinamide.
What about the adenine dinucleotide?
So in this case, in the supplement and enriched forms, and also in enriched, it's also nicotinamide. That's what they add it as. So in that case, we're consuming the vitamin, and then we can convert it to the coenzyme. Is that your question, Michaela?
No, I was going to ask what the main source is in foods then, like in naturally in foods.
Oh, so good question. In animal products, it's usually NAD. Generally found as NAD. That's the highest one. Some NADP. I don't think I have it here, but in vegetables, in most plant products, it tends to have significantly higher levels of nicotinic acid. So in plant products, it's probably mostly nicotinic acid. Okay, so it tends to be fairly widespread. Niacin is also found in tea and coffee and green vegetables tend to have some, and milk is a decent source of niacin. So that handout I gave you for the reading of that, be prepared to answer the question. Give me 2 reasons why milk was found to be a good cure for niacin deficiency. So if we look at this diagram, we can see it's kind of widespread. Up at the top, we have some grains, and that's a lot of it because it's enriched or fortified. And then we look through, we can see, for example, fruits, not great sources of niacin. Then we have dairy products have decent amounts. We can look through some of these. Even some of the plant products that have protein have higher amounts, but if you compare it, for example, ground beef, chicken breast, and tuna, significantly less than those. The RDA. So the DRI is an RDA. and it is 16 milligrams for men, and it is 14 milligrams for women. And we'll talk about the units because I don't see the units here. Should be milligrams niacin equivalents. We'll talk about that. The other day I read something online. Actually, it was on WebMD, and they were talking about, it had something to do with, wasn't niacin, it was another vitamin. And they said that the term DRI is now replacing the older term RDA commonly. And I thought, you guys have no idea what those mean, right? Because they're different things. I thought that was interesting. Yeah, I'm kind of going away from the RDA. Now we're saying the DRI. Okay. So on this, the DRI is an RDA, right? Now, not all niacin in foods is bioavailable. Some niacin in foods is covalently bound to proteins or carbohydrate. If that niacin is covalently bound to a carbohydrate molecule, that molecule is called niacin. If that niacin is covalently bound to part of a protein, that molecule is called a niacinogen. So that occurs in some food products, but it's most common in corn, where that niacin is covalently bound to other molecules. So this is one of the main reasons why corn, if that's a staple in a person's diet and they're not consuming adequate amounts of other things, but especially if you think about when it was deficiency was a big problem, this is one of the main reasons, because the niacin is covalently bound to other molecules, it's not absorbed. However, those molecules can be hydrolyzed or liberated by lime, and this is not lime juice, this is lime, which means calcium hydroxide. Maybe I should put lime water or something here. Okay, so it can liberate some of it, make more of the niacin available, or gastric acid can sometimes liberate some of it, but it's not an adequate amount so that it can still be a problem. So it's not a complete breakdown with just gastric acid. So for example, without that alkali treatment, it's estimated only about 10% of niacin in corn. Without alkali treatment, it's estimated only about 10% of niacin in corn is available for absorption. Okay, I mentioned this before. This is niacin synthesis in the body. This is the first example that we've talked about where we can actually make a vitamin in the body. Is niacin is still essential to the diet? It is. So even though we can make some of it, we definitely want to consume niacin. So it can be synthesized from tryptophan in the liver. That's where almost all of this takes place. The endogenous synthesis can make a significant contribution to niacin levels. However, only a small amount of tryptophan is used to make niacin. Only about 3% of the body's tryptophan is actually used for niacin production. The process requires other vitamins and minerals as well as energy. So the body's nutritional status affects its ability to synthesize niacin. Niacin is still essential in the diet. So let's look at this, and this is going to be simplified. So if we look at this, there's a few things that I want you to remember. And this doesn't have any structure, so in some ways it makes it a little bit more difficult to interpret. If we look upper left, we have tryptophan. That's an essential amino acid. it's estimated to take 60 milligrams of tryptophan to produce 1 milligram of niacin. So that's an important point. It takes about 60 milligrams of tryptophan to produce 1 milligram of niacin. So we're just going to go kind of left to right. We start with tryptophan. It's converted by tryptophan dioxygenase. That enzyme requires iron. So what you can put in your notes is the conversion of tryptophan to NAD requires several other nutrients. Including iron. What else? Riboflavin. PLP. Remember what that one is? B6. Vitamin B6. Those are essential to convert tryptophan to niacin. So deficiencies in any of those other three nutrients can compromise niacin status. So if we go through here, we can see here's where we eventually get nicotinic acid mononucleotide. Then we add an adenine. Then we add an amine group to get to NAD. Once we get to NAD, it's just phosphorylated to get to NADP. So as part of this is what I want you to remember. Now, where is this occurring? In the liver, so in liver cells. So remember when we go from tryptophan, we first synthesize nicotinic acid adenine dinucleotide. Nicotinic acid adenine dinucleotide. So what's the difference there? So now if we go back to this, this is nicotinic acid adenine dinucleotide. So the only difference between this and NAD is that amine group. See the carboxylic acid group on the top here, up there? Then we just add an amine group to form nicotinamide adenine dinucleotide. Remember, that's the only difference between nicotinic acid and nicotinamide is that amine group. So where does the amine group come from? Glutamine. Is glutamine an essential amino acid? It's not. Okay? So I want you to remember from this, the specific part I want you to remember is this nicotinic acid adenine dinucleotide. The conversion requires NAD synthetase. An amine group from glutamine, which gives us glutamate. Uses an ATP and generates NAD. Once you have NAD, it's phosphorylated to NADP. I'm not going to ask you this enzyme. That's pretty easy though, NAD kinase. Okay?
Do you still want us to understand the top part that you explained though?
Just that we're starting from tryptophan and it requires those other three nutrients basically to get to nicotinic acid dinucleotide, that it occurs in the liver, that it takes 60 milligrams to get 1 milligram of niacin. Now, one of the reasons it's so inefficient is this diagram doesn't show it, but there's a lot of other alternatives for quite a few of these molecules. So sometimes it'll start up there with tryptophan, and it might get halfway through, and it diverts to another pathway. So that's why one of the reasons it's not very efficient. Okay, one of the things that we said was that in our diet, we probably consume more. We consume a combination of vitamin and coenzyme form. So digestion absorption of this, and it's similar to thiamine and riboflavin. If we did consume the coenzyme form, it's modified in the gut, so we absorb the vitamin form. So if we consume NAD and NADP, it's modified to the vitamin before it's absorbed.
In the gut.
Yep. Okay, most absorption is in the small intestine. Most absorption is through a specific transporter. So they say it's carrier-mediated facilitated diffusion. So basically it's facilitated diffusion. Unless it's significant amounts. So with high levels of nicotinic acid or nicotinamide, diffusion becomes more significant. Simple diffusion, I should say. So here's an example. What's the RDA? Approximately 16 milligrams, right? One of the things we're going to talk about is, in some cases, niacin therapy is used to improve blood lipids, for example. Some individuals, some people will take 3 to 4 grams a day. And in that case, most of the absorption is through diffusion. Okay, and a couple enzymes to remember. In the gut, pyrophosphatase is an enzyme that basically cleaves right here in between these molecules. And then we have a glycohydrolase that cleaves off between the ribose and the nicotinamide. And that's what makes that nicotinamide available for absorption. Okay, so once it's in the cells in the vitamin form, then it can be modified back to the coenzyme forms if the cell needs to do that.
Can you repeat what we should know about those enzymes?
So they are intestinal enzymes, so they're mostly in the lumen of the small intestine. Pyrophosphatase cleaves between the phosphates. Glycohydrolase cleaves between ribose and nicotinamide. So both enzymes are utilized or used to generate the vitamin for absorption. Okay, so the major functions. So niacin has a lot of functions, and we're going to focus on just the major ones here. And we're gonna see is mostly energy production. That's what we're gonna focus on. So these are pyridine nucleotide coenzymes, NAD and NADP. They're mostly involved in oxidation reduction reactions. There's approximately 200 enzymes in the body that require NAD and NADP. Most of those enzymes are related to energy production. And we've talked about this a lot before. We saw this in 328. Both NAD and NADP use this part of the molecule to function. That cyclic ring structure allows them to accept and donate electrons from hydrogens. So they're involved in oxidation reduction reactions. Most of the enzymes that use them are dehydrogenases. They're removing hydrogens from other molecules and using the NAD mostly to hold on to those hydrogens. All right, NADP and NAD both use that. that part of the molecule. Role as coenzymes. The major role of NADH is to transfer its electrons from metabolic intermediates to the ETC to produce ATP. We're going to say that's its major function. Oxidative reactions in which NAD is reduced to NADH include glycolysis. Remember, there's a step there, so you even need it for anaerobic metabolism. Oxidative decarboxylation of pyruvate, so the bridge step. Need it for the Krebs cycle. Remember, there's 3 steps in Krebs cycle that use NAD. And another really common site of use is beta oxidation of fatty acids. We need FAD, we also need NAD for that. So here's a kind of a summary statement. A major role of NAD is in energy-yielding oxidation reactions. And this is a summary I'll let you guys look at. You've seen that before. The reason I say that is the major role of NADP is in biosynthetic reactions, not necessarily energy production.
What does biosynthetic really mean?
Where it's just synthesizing molecules. That's it. So for example, fatty acid synthesis. Remember when you guys went through that before? Acetyl-CoA, malonyl-CoA, the fatty acid synthase complex. NADPH was the electron donor in that reaction. We looked at this last week. Synthesis of deoxyribonucleotides, where does that happen? Hexose Monophosphate Shunt. All right? If you look at that, it requires transketolase. Transketolase is the TBP-dependent part of it, but the electron source there were NADPs involved there. And the hexose monophosphate shunt is converting NADP to NADPH. So it's making those molecules, and then the NADPH can be used for fatty acid synthesis. So NADP, mostly synthetic reactions. NADH, mostly for energy production. Okay, the RDA for niacin. The RDAs are in niacin equivalents for adults. So the units, and this is important, the units are milligrams of niacin equivalents. So the units for the RDA are milligrams of niacin equivalents. The EARs are slightly lower than the RDA for men and women. For pregnancy and lactation, the RDA is increased to 18 and 17, which is kind of typical. Now, can you think of something that we've talked about? Why wouldn't we just say milligrams of niacin? Something that we've talked about so far. It could be, but in this case, it's not. Oh, good point. And so in this case, it's not, though. What else?
It covers 2 forms, doesn't it? So the acid and the amide.
It could be, yeah, that's another thing to think about, but it's not. Yep. Because you can actually make it from tryptophan. You're not consuming niacin directly, but it becomes niacin. So we compensate for that. So big picture here is when you are trying to determine whether or not a person is getting adequate amounts of niacin, their potential sources of niacin in the body are, it could be nicotinic acid, could be nicotinamide, so we can say it's either niacin or tryptophan, dietary protein. Okay? So the RDA compensates, so you put in your notes the niacin equivalents are meant to compensate for the conversion of tryptophan to niacin.
It
Okay.
would still be counting tryptophan as 16 milligrams to 1. Like that conversion is kept in mind.
30.
Or didn't it take
Six,
it
oh, did you say 16 or 6? In that case, it'll compensate for this.
Or it takes 60.
60.
Yeah.
So the next slide, there's a few steps to it. So I think next time we'll go through that calculation. 1 second, guys. Michaela?
I was wondering how much like 60 milligrams really is. Like, is that like a significant amount kind of thing? Or is it, like,
So that's a good question. I think when we go through the next one, it'll kind of put that in perspective. Yeah, it's not really that much. Yeah. Okay, guys, thank you. I'll see you tomorrow.